Sometimes the most terrifying secrets are hidden, not in the future, but in the past. In locked archives, forgotten ancient texts, in conversations held behind closed doors, classified reports, vanished witnesses, and strange coincidences between Eastern teachings and CIA data form a disturbing picture. Reincarnation may not be just a myth, but an observable phenomenon. Not a belief, but an object of study. Leaks, ancient manuscripts, and special operations hint that the main interest is not the earth, but what leaves the body after death. This investigation leads through forgotten pages of history, classified experiments, and knowledge that is not usually spoken about. Because perhaps we are not just people. Perhaps we are something much more ancient. And someone has been watching this for a long time. We are going to look at the most shocking documented cases, and believe me, in the end, we will ask you and ourselves a far from pleasant question, which will most likely change our outlook on life. When death is not the end, a military incident that changed everything. It happened on the morning of April 12, 1987, White Sands Military Proving Ground, New Mexico. An infrasonic boom ripped through the desert. Monitoring equipment at the base recorded a brief but sharp spike in background radiation. 6 seconds later, magnetic stability in the local area was disrupted. 4 more seconds later, the signal disappeared. Ground surveillance stations immediately sent an alert to the command post. The object had disappeared from radar. No crash, no explosion, no landing, simply vanished. Less than an hour later, a reconnaissance team was sent to the suspected location. 4 soldiers in protective suits, 2 radiochemical monitoring specialists, and 1 operator with a soil spectral analysis device. When they arrived, there was no indication of the presence of equipment. No debris, no traces of metal, no signs of burning, and only after a more careful examination did it become clear that they were standing in a place that had changed at the molecular level. A hemispherical crater gaped in the sand. Its walls were charred, but not by fire. The rock layer seemed to have been fused, as if a precision thermal instrument had been used, scorching the shape with surgical precision. Around the crater are imprints that don't look like footprints. They're elongated depressions, as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. Or someone. At first, the military thought it was a secret exercise, perhaps testing a new aircraft. But soon, something strange began to happen. The first soldier, Private First Class Jeremy North, reported hearing unidentified sounds in his headphones, like human whispers. He removed the headset, but the sound remained. It seemed to be coming from underground. 15 minutes later, another team member, Technician Brian Marshall, froze at the edge of the crater. He stared into space and didn't respond to commands. Later, when he was pulled away and brought to his senses, he reported seeing the figure of a woman. She stood inside the crater looking directly at him and uttered the words he'd heard as a child, the exact words his mother had spoken 3 days before her death. None of the instruments detected anyone's presence. The group was urgently evacuated. All recordings of their communications were confiscated. 2 days later, a closed meeting was held at the central command level. The case materials were classified as secret and given the designation Astral Activation Case 1. Later, the documentation will include the acronym R code related to the study of transient states of consciousness in contact with the UAP phenomenon. The phrase, memory beyond time, will be underlined in red. But the most disturbing development came later. A week after the incident, one of the group's members, Lieutenant Freeman, was hospitalized with symptoms of acute mental illness. He couldn't sleep, claiming to be in 2 bodies at once. In one, he was lying in a hospital room. In the other, he was sitting on a hilltop in Tibet, waiting for someone. He accurately described the landscape, the temple, even the interior of the sanctuary. Amazingly, a month and a half later, satellite photography of one of the high mountain areas in India confirmed that a similar structure, previously not shown on any map, was indeed located there. Another participant, the same technician Brian Marshall, after leaving the army unexpectedly entered university and defended a dissertation on Eastern philosophy. In his work, he argued that human consciousness is not a closed system, but a node connected to a continuous flow of information that does not disappear after death. He called this the Chronicle of Return. His manuscript later fell into the hands of independent researchers from the Gateway Project. In one of the footnotes, there was a line, Example, number 4. A confirmed flash of reincarnation memory through contact with an unknown form of anomalous energy influence. The influence of an external mind cannot be ruled out. This incident marked the first recorded attempt to officially link UFO sightings to the phenomenon of past life memories. And although the reports were hidden, It was from this point that a series of secret programs began to explore the intersection between life, death, and what might lie beyond human perception. What happened in the desert in April 1987 remains unknown, but the fact remains. Since then, all soldiers serving in the area have undergone mandatory psychological screening, and the region's maps are updated every 6 months. It's as if someone or something continues to be active in a place where the boundaries between realities were once breached. Project Gate. In 2003, a folder containing a long internal code purported to be part of Project Gateway was accidentally discovered in a storage facility at the U.S. National Military Archives. On the cover was a red stamp indicating a closed division of the National Security Agency and 2 words that do not appear in any public transaction log. A study of this folder revealed that for nearly 20 years, secret experiments on transcendence of consciousness were conducted at Fort Meade. Not within the realm of mysticism, not a religious trance, and under the control of military scientists, biophysicists, and psychoenergetic specialists. Project Gateway was launched back in 1978. It was led by Lieutenant Colonel Wayne McDonnell, a man with an impeccable service record and access to all levels of top-secret programs. Its purpose is to discover whether altered states of consciousness can be used for reconnaissance, communication with unidentified objects, and, most importantly, for understanding the nature of life after death. According to the report, the first phase of the experiment involved deep sensory deprivation, followed by exposure of the brain to low-frequency sound pulses. Later, binaural signals were added, a special frequency that causes the brain hemispheres to enter a synchronized state. The effect was unexpected. The subjects began to see images unrelated to their personal memories. They recalled events they hadn't participated in. Some described scenes from times they had no connection to, wars, epidemics, the collapse of civilizations. One of the women, an intelligence officer, began speaking in a language during the 4th session that was later identified as a Sumerian dialect. Another participant described with frightening precision the structure and interior of an Egyptian temple destroyed 1,000 years BC. Neither of these individuals had encountered such information before. But the strangest thing began when a man named Thomas M. was invited to the experiment. He wasn't a scientist, had no formal education, and worked as a technician at a communications base in Virginia. After the 2nd session, he began claiming he'd been a soldier in another time, not on Earth. His words were recorded on audio, and they included references to technology, command structure, equipment details, and even the architecture of a base located on another celestial body. In subsequent sessions, he not only described his death, but also claimed to have undergone a process of recreation in a new body on Earth. He called this the wave transference. Colonel McDonnell's report, which was later made public through the Freedom of Information Act, contains a phrase that has been quoted by all researchers on the subject ever since. Consciousness is not a product of the brain. The brain is an interface. Consciousness is continuous energy, looped into the multi-layered structure of the universe. He called this structure the coincidence matrix. What does this mean? McDonnell argued that the universe is not an infinite space, but a hologram in which each element contains information about the whole. If this is true, then memory, experience, and personality do not disappear with the death of the body. They are stored in the field structure. Moreover, there is a way to connect to this field, consciously. And perhaps this is precisely what those we call aliens are doing. The final section of the report contains a warning. If interaction with external carriers of consciousness is confirmed, it will call into question the entire concept of linear life. It will change our understanding of identity, citizenship, the legal status of individuals, and even the concept of time. And finally, the potential risks include the paradox of return. This is a phenomenon in which a personality from a previous life begins to recognize itself within a new one, causing a conflict between the old and current consciousness. Such cases will be studied in a separate series, classified equally confidentially. This project was officially closed in 2001, but just 3 years later, its materials surfaced in another secret program called Eclipse, within the framework of which events began to occur, indicating that whoever the observers were, they knew much more about us than we know about ourselves. And perhaps it was they who once put the mechanism of reincarnation into our biological code. Children who remember someone else's death. In 2006, in the central Indian province of Madhya Pradesh, a 5-year-old boy named Arjun began to behave strangely. He didn't respond to his name, refused to sleep in his room, and spoke in a dialect unknown to his family. At times, he would wake up in tears, begging not to be burned and claiming he was already dead. His parents, the village teachers, dismissed this as a game or an illness. But a few weeks later, the boy gave his first and last name. a completely different one. He said his name was Amit Varma, and that he was killed while leaving his shop in the town of Katni. He accurately described the street, the building next door, the color of the sign, and the location of the cash register keys. The story reached a local reporter. He contacted the Katni police. Surprisingly, police records did indeed list a murder case involving a man named Amit Varma, who died from a gunshot wound to the back of the head near a grocery store in 2002. That is 4 years before Arjun was born. The boy and his family had never been to this city. They had no television, no internet, no contact with the deceased's relatives. When Arjun was brought to Katni, he instantly recognized the streets. He pointed to the house where he lived, walked up to the woman, called her by name, and spoke the words she had heard her late husband speak before his death. The woman fainted. Neighbors confirmed it. The boy knew details that couldn't have been gleaned from anyone else. He even showed her the hiding place in the wall where Amit kept his savings. The money was there. This case attracted the attention of researchers from the Delhi Institute of Parapsychology. They conducted a series of tests, including associative quizzes, memory tests, and reactions to photographs. The boy unmistakably identified the deceased's friends, knew their nicknames, and even events that were not recorded in police reports but were confirmed by eyewitness accounts. This wasn't an isolated incident. From 1973 to 2011, more than 250 similar stories were recorded in India, Burma, Laos, and Tibet. But the most astonishing cases began to appear in countries where the culture of reincarnation was not widespread. In 2012 in Virginia, USA, a 4-year-old boy named Nathan suddenly began drawing airplanes, destroyed houses, and maps of areas his parents couldn't identify. He confidently claimed his name was James, that he had been a pilot in World War II and had died when his plane was shot down over the Pacific Ocean. He described the type and model of the fighter, its nose number, and the layout of the cockpit instruments. An investigation revealed that a pilot with that name and background did indeed exist. James Houston, a U.S. Navy lieutenant shot down by Japanese artillery in 1945. The aircraft's registration number matched. American scientists, including Dr. Jim Tucker from the University of Virginia, have launched a large-scale study. They noted patterns. Children usually begin talking about a past life between the ages of 3 and 6. Memories fade by age 10. But the key is that more than 60% of the descriptions matched real people, places, and events, including confidential details that were not published. All of these materials were later transferred to a closed analytical center that collaborated with the Gateway program. There, the cases were grouped under a new designation: cases of reincarnation, coincidence with confirmed facts. Maps began to emerge within these archives. It turned out that most cases of so-called past life memory occur not randomly, but in specific regions. These regions were called return sectors. What do these zones have in common? They're all either near major energy anomalies or have recorded activity from unidentified flying objects. This raises a disturbing thought. Perhaps someone or something isn't simply observing the migration of consciousnesses. Perhaps it's being orchestrated. Perhaps the mechanism of reincarnation isn't spontaneous, but rather technical. What if the soul isn't an abstract category, but an information structure, a code, and the memory of a past life is a glitch in the erasure protocol? Or conversely, conscious access. If this is true, then each new birth is not a coincidence, but part of a larger process. A process that continues regardless of our will. And if there are those who started this process, then the question arises, who are they? And why do they want us to forget who we were? Distorted memory and external trace. In 2015, neurobiology professor Peter Walden of the Copenhagen Institute studied rare cases of so-called sudden deep memory. This is a phenomenon in which a patient with no apparent mental disorder suddenly begins to have memories that do not correspond to his real life. People described events they had never experienced, places they had never been, and even languages they had never spoken. Walden was skeptical of such stories until one day his patient, a 32-year-old woman named Clara, began speaking in ancient Aramaic. She described life in a fortified settlement, mentioned names, events, and even described the plague that struck the region. A thorough examination will confirm the matches with historical chronicles are almost perfect. Together with his team, he began a systematic study, tracking brain activity during these spontaneous states. MRI, electroencephalography, and spectral analysis were used. The results were paradoxical. During the dives, abnormal stimulation of the pineal gland was observed. This region of the brain has long been linked to time perception, dreams, and mystical states. But in the case of Walden's patients, pineal gland activity reached levels only seen in people in a state of clinical death. They were not asleep, drugged, or hypnotized, yet their brains behaved as if they were dying. The professor later contacted a group of anonymous specialists working under contract for a government agency. One of them provided him with data from an old Air Force program shut down in 1998. The program was called ECHO. It focused not on searching for flying saucers, but on documenting field memory impairments in UFO witnesses. Under top-secret label, it collected testimonies from people who, after contact, began to recall other lives. Among them were military personnel, children, villagers, and even pilots. One of them, a U.S. Navy captain, claimed after an incident near the Bahamas that for several minutes he felt like he was inside someone else's body, in another time, in another space. He knew the man's name, his past fate, his final thoughts before death. He later revealed that it was the moment of his death aboard a ship that sank over 100 years ago. He had no access to the data or contact with the deceased crew, but a check revealed that the name he gave was listed among the dead, down to the letter. Then we went even deeper. In the ECHO project, documents contained a report on one of the most mysterious phenomena, memory impairment recorded at the moment of bright flashes of light emanating from the observed objects. Witnesses didn't simply lose time, as in classic abduction episodes. They reported feeling as if someone was rummaging around inside them, changing the structure of their memories, erasing, replacing, implanting new images, and sometimes leaving behind old ones, those that don't pertain to this life. Based on this data, a risky but logical thesis was put forward in the mid-2000s. What if the reincarnation process includes a stage of forced memory erasure? What if it's not a spontaneous phenomenon, but a controlled one? And what if the glitches that cause children to remember past lives aren't mysticism, but errors in the cleansing algorithm? And what if UFOs and those who control them aren't just observers, but operators of this process, inside the ECHO program? The hypothesis of the existence of a structure, conditionally called the zeroing level, was considered. This is an invisible zone, not physical, but rather energetic, through which consciousness is believed to pass between lives. And in this zone, external interventions are possible. A similar concept is found in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which describes the bardo state, a transition in which the entity faces illusions, fears, temptations, and choices. Perhaps in modern terms, this is a state of loading a new personality with an attempt to reset the previous one. But if the erasure process can be disrupted, that's technology. And if erasure technology exists, then there must also be restoration technology. In 2017, during a report on extending budget funding for a special intelligence program, one of the officials participating in a closed discussion uttered a remark that was not included in the minutes. It was remembered by a member of the surveillance team. The quote was, "They don't just look down on us from the sky. They are our administrators, and what we call life is just one cycle in a long chain that someone has already started many times." If this is true, then the question becomes different. Not who we are, but who we were, and who decided we can't remember that. Reincarnation as a mechanism, ancient doctrines, and the dictionary of another science. For millennia, different cultures have described the same images, symbols, and stages after death. They were separated by continents, eras, and languages, but the similarities were striking. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of Coming Out, Greek myths about the rivers of oblivion, Vedic ideas about the transmigration of the soul. All of them spoke of a path after death, of some kind of judgment, of purification and return. In Egyptian tradition, the god Anubis greets the deceased, weighing their heart on the scales of Ma'at. If the heart is heavier than the feather of truth, the soul is devoured by a monster. If it is lighter, it continues on its journey. In Tibet, after death, the soul passes through 49 days of bardo, a transitional state between incarnations. It is tempted, frightened, and seduced. If the entity recognizes the illusory nature of these images, it can break out of the cycle. If not, it returns to a new body. All these descriptions share one common theme. Human consciousness never dies. It is being transformed. But the key difference between ancient doctrines and the modern scientific approach lies in the terminology. What was previously called the soul can today be designated as a structured form of an immaterial information field. What was called karma is perhaps a set of energy patterns anchored in a field, and memory is a fragment recorded in a holographic matrix independent of the brain. It was this concept that was first attempted to be formalized in 1996 as part of a Japanese private scientific initiative called Project Revolver. Participants, including linguists, physicists, and scholars of Eastern philosophy, sought ways to synthesize the languages of ancient texts into a unified system of concepts. They created a kind of transition dictionary, a set of terms describing events after death without reference to religious dogma. One of these terms, the path of restart, did not mean birth, but rather the moment of return in which consciousness chooses a scenario, a body, a context. They argued that this choice is made not at the level of desire, but as a result of a natural energetic resonance. If consciousness carries certain frequencies, it can only manifest in a context that aligns with them. Thus, poverty, suffering, genius, and loneliness are not punishments, but rather points of attraction. A reciprocal effect occurs. The universe returns you to where you've already been. But even stranger was the term they borrowed from Tibetan teachings and reformulated into a technical equivalent. It was called the imprinting node. This is the moment when consciousness encounters an emotional or mental impulse so powerful that the image persists even after death. These nodes, according to researchers, can manifest as inexplicable fears, habits, and predispositions in new lives. Later, some of the Project Revolver materials leaked to independent academic publications, but most of their archives disappeared. Researchers claimed they were approached by representatives of the Japanese. The Ministry of Defense demanded that the activities be stopped, citing the threat of data leakage related to possible mind control. One of the project participants, Dr. Hideo Matsumoto, left behind a manuscript after the group's disappearance in which he formulated a frightening hypothesis. He wrote that the mechanism of rebirth is not a spiritual process, as is commonly believed. It is closer to a technological one, programmed, cyclical, and controlled from the outside. Elements such as the choice of body, time, and place of birth are not up to the individual. They are assigned. He didn't say by whom exactly, but he left behind a phrase that formed the basis of his entire concept. We are not born into this world. We are assigned here. If we accept this point of view, then reincarnation ceases to be a philosophical hope. It becomes a system, and any system can have glitches, errors, and interventions. And then what matters isn't who you were, but who brought you back, and why. Contact with someone who first observes and then embodies. In 2018, in South America, in a remote area on the border of Peru and Brazil, a group of researchers studying local shamanic practices recorded a case that was later included in a classified report by the European Network for the Study of Borderline States of Consciousness. It was an episode in which ritual, contact with an unidentified object, and a vivid memory of a life unrelated to the participant in the ceremony merged. A man named Lucas, 40 years old, from São Paulo, had no mental illness, did not practice spiritual practices, and came to the jungle for the first time to undergo the ayahuasca ritual. He expected hallucinations, fears, perhaps even emotional outbursts. But instead, he said, he found himself in the body of another person. He knew his name wasn't Lucas. He saw acid-scorched hands, a sandy plain all around, tall metal columns, and he felt the memories of not just one life, but several at once. He described reliving the moments of death, not just once, but 10, 20. He claimed to have seen the moment of memory downloading, heard a voice giving him instructions, and felt himself being sent back. Not to heaven, not to hell, just to a new shell. He called those who did this overseers, not gods, not demons, but beings who controlled the reincarnation system, managing the cycles like an engineer controls a machine. His story would have been dismissed as a normal vision from a psychoactive substance. But several weeks later, when one of the researchers was reviewing satellite images of the area where the ritual was being performed, he noticed a strange formation, a circle perfectly scorched in the jungle. Radius, 23 meters. Inside, bleached vegetation, distorted magnetic fields, and a lost GPS signal. This wasn't the result of a fire. Everything pointed to a focused thermal effect. A day after the circle's appearance, 3 people from another group, 15 kilometers away, reported seeing an object in the sky above the trees. It was silent, glowed faintly, and didn't rotate. 20 seconds later, it disappeared. The cameras didn't pick it up, but the animals in the area scattered, and the electronics malfunctioned. Later, the data about the circle was sent to specialists working with the Gateway program. They superimposed the coordinates on a map of activity compiled from dozens of spontaneous past life memory episodes. And they discovered that in this area, over the past 15 years, there have been more than 5 cases of children talking about events unrelated to their lives. All of them lived within a 30-kilometer radius of this location. After collating this data, analysts hypothesized that in locations where anomalous objects appear, a temporary weakening of the memory erasure mechanism is detected. This is called a zone of delamination. At such moments, the individual consciousness can access past fragments disconnected from the current personality. And this is always accompanied by a feeling that someone is observing what is happening. The word observation was repeated in all the testimonies. Some described the sensation of being watched. Others described a feeling as if something without form but with intent was behind their backs. Several children who spoke of past lives expressed a fear of mirrors, dense darkness, and especially the sound of an electric hum. They described this sound in the same way, like the trembling of the air before something emerges from the shadows. All this may seem like a chain of coincidences, but if we accept that reincarnation is not spontaneous but directed, then such coincidences are like the logic of the system. And if someone truly monitors the cycles, directs, resets, and intervenes at moments of transition, then they have long been among us, not as a figurehead on a ship, but as an engineer of the structure, an overseer, a manager, not divine, but with access to memory, time, and souls. One of the anonymous agents working on the emergency line described his inner experience during the investigation. He said that at some point, he began to feel like he was being watched, not by the authorities or by people, but by a system that knew who he had been before and who he would become in the future. If this is true, then reincarnation is not the soul's path. It is the work of someone else's mathematics, and we are merely fragments of code that are sometimes allowed to remember. They return before us who came before people, but remember through us. Almost all ancient texts, from the Indian Puranas to Sumerian cuneiform, repeat the same idea. Humans are not the first, and perhaps not the most important, link in the chain of intelligence. There is someone who came before, who wielded technology, an understanding of the laws of time and space, and whose influence is still felt today. But what if they didn't just leave traces behind? What if they left us behind? Or more accurately, fragments of themselves within us. In 2010, archaeologists exploring a site in the Göbekli Tepe region of Turkey discovered a carved stone with an image that had long eluded decipherment. The stone was decorated with more than just abstract symbols. There were carvings of human figures with elongated skulls, surrounded by spirals resembling a DNA strand. Some of the figures had an eye surrounded by a ring on their foreheads. One of the symbols was almost a verbatim copy of the Tibetan word for incarnation. These stones are over 11,000 years old. They are older than the pyramids, older than Sumer, older even than the first cities. But why did primitive people, who had no written language, depict scenes clearly beyond the scope of their everyday life? Who gave them knowledge of the structure of DNA? Why did they depict birth from light, and next to it, a point of descent from which a human figure emerges? Archaeologists have called this a ritual cycle. But one independent researcher has put forward a more radical theory. It's an instruction manual. The stone shows the cycle of incarnation captured not as a myth, but as a sequence of processes. This hypothesis again resonates with the concept of conscious reincarnation associated with external intervention. Researchers at the Gateway Project, back in the 1980s, spoke of the presence of recurring patterns in trance states. People described identical rooms, identical technologies, and the same figures accompanying them during the transition between lives. These figures were tall, with elongated skulls, and always stood at a table or panel surrounded by glowing symbols. Are these brain archetypes or actual experiences? Several of these descriptions were later compared with reports of creatures allegedly observed during UFO encounters. The pilot's reports featured the same images: thin, hairless, with large eyes, but not aggressive. Rather, they seemed to be observing. A similar phenomenon was recorded in Argentina in 1993. A family of farmers reported that, for several nights in a row, points of light appeared in the sky above the farm, moving along complex trajectories. On the third night, their 8-year-old son suddenly claimed to remember living in another city, another body, and dying in a fire. He gave his address, name, and even his apartment number. When journalists checked the information, everything matched. A man with those details had died 8 years earlier. The boy had never been to that city. But the strangest thing happened a week later. The boy began drawing strange symbols: circles, triangles, lines with dots at the ends. His mother decided to show the drawings to a linguistics expert. He immediately recognized them. The symbols were similar to those carved into the walls of Göbekli Tepe. And even though 11,000 years had passed, the structure was repeated with eerie precision. Coincidence? Then how can we explain the fact that similar symbols were also drawn by other children who experienced spontaneous flashes of past life memories? Their drawings were collected in the closed archives of the American Institute for Consciousness Studies. Researchers attempted to superimpose them on maps of the Earth's magnetic fields. They discovered that most memory episodes are activated at points where distorted magnetic activity is detected. This can only mean one thing. The memory doesn't belong to the body. It is activated by the field. And if a memory field exists, then someone can navigate it. Someone can not only observe, but also download. Perhaps these someones aren't aliens in the classic sense. Perhaps they are former inhabitants of Earth. Those who created the migration mechanism and then departed for other dimensions, but left behind a control system. If they're gone, then why do they watch? Why do they appear at the moment of birth, death, transformation? Why do they intervene when memory breaks through oblivion? Perhaps because they are a part of us. Perhaps because we are their continuation, their biological and mental containers. They didn't return to Earth because they never left. They were always within us. Tibetan monks who practice the Thukdam technique, a conscious exit from the body, say the same thing. At the moment of death, experienced practitioners supposedly linger between worlds, remaining in the body for up to 3 weeks after the physical cessation of the heart's function. Their bodies do not decompose. The face remains soft. Studies of such cases have shown that brain activity can persist longer than previously thought possible, and the monks claim that during this time, they observe themselves, others, the system. What if, in these moments, they access the level of consciousness occupied by the overseers? And if so, then reincarnation isn't just a transition, it's communication. A subtle transfer of knowledge, state, experience. But only if you can retain the memory. Most can't, most forget, because that's how the system works. But sometimes there's a glitch. Sometimes someone breaks through, and that's when they show up. Not to kill, but to erase, to keep the system closed. If this is true, then humanity is trapped inside a mechanism designed not for freedom, but for perpetual cycle. And those we call aliens aren't aliens at all. They're us, just before we were sent back. The soul code. Why some remember and others don't. When it comes to reincarnation, most people imagine it as something mystical, spontaneous, and equal for everyone. The soul leaves the body, passes into another dimension, and then returns again, having forgotten everything that came before. But if the system of reincarnation is truly universal, why do only a few remember their past lives, while the remaining millions travel this path in complete ignorance? What distinguishes those who remember? Many cases of spontaneous recall occur in children aged 3 to 7. But even among children, such episodes are extremely rare. According to statistics compiled by scientists at the University of Virginia, only 1 in every 10,000 children demonstrates stable, evidence-based memory. Moreover, the older a child gets, the less likely they are to remember anything. By the age of 8 to 10, memories disappear almost completely. It's as if at some point a filter is activated, erasing access to the past. But what exactly activates this filter? And can it be turned off? There are several hypotheses. The first is biological. Some researchers believe that past life memories are activated by a specific brain state. In childhood, neuroplasticity and activity in the right hemisphere are higher than in adults. The right hemisphere is responsible for visual thinking, intuition, associations, everything that resembles a trance or meditation state. It is in these states that spontaneous memories most often occur. Perhaps in children, especially during certain age windows, access to the field of consciousness of the past remains open longer than usual. Dr. James Tucker, a leading expert on the phenomenon of reincarnation memory, noted that most children who remember a past life also exhibit sleep characteristics. They experience more vivid dreams, suffer from nightmares, and sometimes talk in their sleep. This may indicate an unstable boundary between the subconscious and conscious mind, allowing memories to surface. But there is also a second, deeper level, energetic. In 2009, a group of researchers from the Institute of Applied Bioenergetics in the Netherlands conducted an experiment. They studied the electromagnetic radiation emitted by the bodies of children with confirmed cases of past lives. All participants experienced abnormal pulsations in the heart and head region, out of sync with normal body rhythms. These pulsations were not threatening, but were persistently recorded during emotional memory stimulation. This led scientists to hypothesize that reincarnation memories are not a product of the brain, but an informational trace in the personal energy field. In other words, memory isn't something contained within the head, but something the surrounding field of consciousness retains as an imprint. In some people, especially children, this field is unstable, and it is precisely because of this instability that fragments of the past leak into the present. According to Eastern doctrines, the soul undergoes a process of forgetting during reincarnation, an artificial cleansing of previous experiences. Hinduism and Buddhism believe this is necessary for growth, to avoid attachment to the past. However, ancient texts also mention that this process may be incomplete. If consciousness died suddenly, in a state of intense emotion, fear, pain, anger, or love, the memory becomes ingrained and cannot be completely erased. Such fragments are called samskaras. They are stored deep in the subconscious and can manifest in the next life. Modern scientists call such phenomena emotional imprinting. It's a kind of energetic burn in the field structure, like a scar. It doesn't disappear even after the body dies. And if in the next incarnation a person is born with high sensitivity, an unstable neural network, or increased activity in the right hemisphere, the scar becomes active. This becomes what we perceive as a sudden memory of a past life. Another strange factor was also identified: family history. Research in India and Sri Lanka showed that 68% of children who exhibited past life memories were born into families with a history of unusual dreams, visions, or mystical experiences. Some parents claimed to have felt something similar as children but forgot it as they grew older. This raises the obvious question: is past life sensitivity hereditary? Geneticists studying this issue discovered a curious detail. Some children who recall past lives had a rare mutation in the gene responsible for processing dopamine and serotonin, neurotransmitters associated with the perception of time, emotion, and memory. Although this mutation is not directly linked to reincarnation, it indicates a heightened sensitivity of the brain to internal cues. This means that such children may be biologically predisposed to perceive non-material information. Perhaps there's a kind of soul code, a combination of genetic, energetic, and neuropsychic parameters that prevents memory erasure from working completely. And something is embedded in this code that allows one to see what others cannot. If memories of past lives can surface spontaneously, then a natural question arises. Can this be deliberately provoked? Is it possible to learn to remember rather than wait for the memory to surface? And if so, why is this so carefully ignored by mainstream science? The first attempts to activate memory were made by the Tibetan and Indian schools, particularly those who practiced so-called remembrance through death. This is a practice in which a monk meditates on an illusory death, passing through the stages of dissolution, peace, emptiness, and rebirth. It is believed that with a sufficient level of awareness, a person can transcend the cycle. But if that is not possible, they gain access to past incarnations. In the 19th century, this idea began to be adapted to the Western scientific approach. This is how regression hypnotherapy emerged, a method in which a person, under deep hypnosis, returns to moments not recorded in their biographical memory. In 1988, a series of experiments were recorded in London in which patients who had never left Great Britain began to describe life in Egypt during the 18th century. Dynasties. One of them began speaking an ancient Egyptian language, which was later identified from museum records. The psychologists involved in this experiment refused to officially publish the data. One of them, anonymously, reported that intelligence officials intervened, interested in the possibility of transferring strategic information from the past. According to unconfirmed reports, several patients were later isolated. In the early 2000s, interest in regression began to grow rapidly. Private centers, research foundations, and independent memory schools emerged. Many of them were associated with the practices of lucid dreaming, trance breathing, and affirmation work. Some claimed that memories could be triggered through bodywork. Certain areas allegedly stored energy traces, and pressing on them triggered flashes of memory. In 2011, an experiment codenamed Project Wiederkehr, Return, was conducted in Germany. The goal was to create conditions under which a person could recreate an episode from a past life without hypnosis. Participants were presented with sounds, smells, phrases, and images derived from ancient texts. The combination of sensory deprivation and complete silence produced something unexpected. Several people entered a state akin to catalepsy. When they regained consciousness, they described the scenes with extraordinary detail. Their pulse and blood pressure recorded bioreactions similar to those observed during real memories. In other words, the body believed what it saw. But the most interesting thing is that later, one of the participants began keeping a diary, recording dates, names, and geographical locations. He described a city that doesn't exist on modern maps. However, after analysis by historians, it was discovered that an ancient Babylonian chronicle did indeed mention a city by that name. It was destroyed more than 3,000 years ago. None of the experiment participants had access to this information beforehand. Can a memory be faked? Absolutely. But when the information matches archival data the subject couldn't have known, a question arises. Or maybe they did see it somewhere. Or maybe they remembered it. Not as a fantasy, but as an experience. Proponents of the theory of artificially awakened memory claim that everyone is theoretically capable of recalling their past lives. However, 3 barriers stand in the way. The first is fear. Fear of what you'll learn. If your death was cruel, if you were a criminal, a traitor, a slave, or an executioner, the psyche resists remembering, even unconsciously. The second is identity. We are so tightly attached to our current self-image that any information that disrupts this stability is rejected. We don't want to be anyone else. We want to be ourselves, even if that's not the whole truth. The third is the systemic filter. If the reincarnation system is controlled from the outside, it's protected. This means there are mental barriers, energy codes embedded in DNA or the brain. In this case, remembering isn't a natural process, but a glitch, or a breakthrough. Interestingly, in some cases, memories come not through practice, but through strong emotional experiences. Accidents, clinical death, the loss of loved ones. There are hundreds of testimonies of people after a coma beginning to speak a different language, claiming to have a different name, or demonstrating skills they had never learned. A Canadian boy, who fell into a coma after falling down a flight of stairs, woke up and began writing from right to left in ancient Greek. It was later discovered that the text he was reproducing was part of a philosophical dialogue that had survived only in fragments. If all this is true, then reincarnation memory isn't a privilege of a select few, but a temporarily disabled function, and like any function, it can be restored. But another question arises. Is it worth it? Can a person who remembers who they were live as before? Will they want to remain in this body, in this role, in this life, knowing that it is just another mask? Or will this knowledge destroy the personality, or liberate it? Perhaps the answer lies in the code itself. Perhaps the code doesn't erase the memory of evil, but protects us from ourselves, until we're ready to remember everything. Reincarnation in military programs, weapons of memory. In 1974, a strange formulation appeared in an internal CIA report, long kept top secret. The potential for using an individual's unconventional experience for informational infiltration. Back then, no one knew that this wasn't espionage in the traditional sense, but rather the use of memories that didn't belong to that person. Memories from another life. It all began with one incident. A young agent training at a saboteur school demonstrated unexpected knowledge about the operation of a missile base on Soviet territory. He claimed he'd never been to the region, but he described it with astonishing accuracy. The architecture, the antenna placement, the type of fuel, even the staff's duty schedule. The investigation revealed that the database did indeed exist. The information was 80% accurate. After this incident, he was interrogated in more detail. Under hypnosis, he began to say that he had previously served at this base, just not in this life. He gave his name, rank, even the year of his death, 1983. A matching person was found in the databases. His name was Alexei Sorokin. He died in an explosion at the facility. The identity matched. This episode became the starting point for a project later called Transition Number 3. Its goal was to study the transfer of professional memory between lives. If a soldier or scout who died in the past is born again and retains some of his skills and knowledge, this can become a strategic resource. They began forming experimental groups. They studied children with a heightened inclination toward technical thinking, those who, from an early age, demonstrated skills that could not be explained by education. A 7-year-old boy from Texas, with no experience whatsoever, built a radio transmitter circuit using parts from a vacuum cleaner and an old television. His grandfather was a mechanic, but the boy himself had no access to technical literature. It soon became clear that the boy often drew buildings with towers resembling radar installations. He said that in a past life, he heard a signal and disappeared into the fog. The project was later expanded. They began testing the hypothesis of whether these memories could be manipulated. They also explored ways to activate the desired fragment, for example, if the individual had a history of intelligence, weapons, or strategic planning. Hypnosis, neurostimulation, and isolation chambers were used. Some subjects did indeed show increased cognitive performance, but there were also side effects. One man, after the 5th session, began claiming to be a German engineer who worked on the rocket program in 1943. He began writing formulas, some of which matched the drawings of the actual V2 project. He was isolated and 2 months later transferred to a psychiatric facility. The diagnosis was split personality disorder. However, the project wasn't shut down. It merely changed its code. From 1982 onward, all U.S. work in this area was transferred to private defense contractors. Similar programs soon began in the USSR. In parallel with the American experiments, the Soviet Union developed its own program in the 1980s. It wasn't called the Reincarnation Project. Officially, it was known as the Neuronal Heritage Program. But in fact, cases were studied in which people recalled information they didn't have access to. Among these was an engineer from Sverdlovsk who, by his own account, saw a diagram of an engine in a dream that didn't exist at the time. When it was reconstructed on paper, it matched the drawings of the German prototype from the beginning of World War II, destroyed in the archives of the Third Reich. Interest intensified when a boy with a rare hand deformity was born in Novosibirsk. He suffered from seizures, during which he spoke broken German and called himself Becker. This wasn't just delusional thinking. He knew the engine models, the types of steel, and the exact location of the old airbase near Leipzig. Historians have confirmed that such bases actually existed. Soviet scientists began searching for patterns. They hypothesized a persistent stream of consciousness, a kind of informational substance that, like magnetic tape, is rewritten to a new medium. In this case, into a new brain. According to their model, consciousness is not a soul in the religious sense, but a structured cluster of data, experience, skills, and instincts. If the recording is not erased at death, it migrates, sometimes by accident, sometimes through a directed channel. One of the scientists working on the program subsequently emigrated to Israel. Under the pseudonym L. Mirovich, he published an open report describing an attempt to create a pure protocol, a mechanism that would allow elements of one person's experience to be recorded and artificially implanted in another. Essentially, it was a prototype for digital migration. He claimed that the development was part of the work on next-generation soldiers. The goal was to transfer combat experience, memory, and knowledge from veterans to new recruits, without the need for training. The method allegedly involved stimulating specific areas of the brain during deep meditation, as well as immersing the participants in a trance-like state. The effect was inconsistent. In some cases, skills emerged, while in others, emotional distortions, aggression, and depersonalization occurred. According to Mirovich, one of the experiments ended in disaster. A volunteer, imbued with the memories of an experienced intelligence officer, began to identify himself not as the subject, but as his donor. He claimed a different name, demanded to be returned to Afghanistan, and described the coordinates of the area and combat routes. A week later, he had to be hospitalized. He fell into catatonia, from which he never recovered. The project was shut down. The archives disappeared. The participants either left or died under mysterious circumstances. But the very fact that the same idea was being developed simultaneously in two opposing states cannot be a coincidence. This means that someone else, above the military, above the governments, was either directing this research or overseeing it. Perhaps to test whether reincarnation can be used as a weapon. Not a religious one, but an informational one. Because if memory can be transferred, it can also be erased. And if it can be erased, it can be replaced. Projects like Gateway, Transition 3, or Neuroheritage are rarely discussed publicly today. However, closed scientific forums regularly discuss instances of people demonstrating other people's skills without training. Sometimes at the age of 20, 40, or 60, sometimes after an injury, sometimes after clinical death. And each time one motif is repeated, they don't know who they were, but they feel they were someone, and that someone hasn't disappeared. If these memories can be systemically activated, then a person is not a goal, they are a tool, and the past is not a memory, but a resource. What if you're already dead? Simulation, replay, and exit point. In 1998, a group of physicists from Chicago published a report on a phenomenon they called a structural mirror. This is a hypothetical model in which the universe reflects not only matter, but also information itself. According to this theory, everything that exists is recorded in some universal matrix. And if so, then nothing disappears. Not even the individual. Almost 20 years later, in 2015, a lucid dreaming experiment was conducted at the UC Berkeley Sleep Lab. One of the participants, in a deep sleep, suddenly said out loud that he was here again, and this was the 5th time. Upon awakening, he had no memory of what he had said. But over the next few days, he began experiencing intense bouts of déjà vu, feeling like he was living someone else's life. Soon he began drawing endless halls, identical faces, codes that repeated themselves in all his dreams. It wasn't schizophrenia. It wasn't an illness. It was activation. Throughout history, humanity has strived to understand what happens after death. But what if the question was initially framed incorrectly? What if death is not an end or a transition, but simply a repetition? What if you've already died? Various cultures around the world have legends about eternal return. The ancient Greeks had the theory of the eternal circle. The Hindus had samsara. In Egyptian tradition, it's the duat, the space in which the soul wanders until it's worthy of liberation. All these descriptions point to a cycle, but no one says who started it. If you are inside the cycle, who is outside? For decades, researchers into the phenomenon of reincarnation have documented recurring patterns. Children recalling their past lives often mention being given permission to do something. A girl from Syria, a war survivor, said that in a previous life she too had died in a fire. She added, "They brought me back because I wasn't finished. They brought me back. They didn't give birth." This word is repeated too often to be a coincidence. A former U.S. intelligence officer who worked on the Gateway program wrote the following in his personal notes. "Death isn't a period, it's a checkpoint. If you fail the scenario, you're re-uploaded, but your memory is reset. Not all of it, only the one that gets in the way." These words weren't included in the official documents. But rumors about the phenomenon of the recursive personality loop have long circulated among the project's staff. In it, a person lives the same life, with variations, until they accomplish something important. What it is unknown. Perhaps this is why some people feel like they've been there before. They feel like they're familiar with what's happening. They sense a transition, but can't explain where it's coming from. There's a hypothesis unofficially known as the first death theory. It holds that the death you've already experienced is the real one. Everything that follows is a simulated rewrite. In other words, you died, but your consciousness was preserved and transferred to a duplicate environment. Inside it, you continue life, unaware that this is no longer the primary reality. Psychologists studying borderline states of consciousness often record feelings of detachment from the world in patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. They describe themselves as unreal, as if they were in a movie where everything repeats itself. One man who returned from the war said he felt as if he had seen it all before, and that those around him were actors repeating a memorized script. Coincidentally or not, in 2017, during a hypnotic regression, one patient immersed in a deep memory state said, "I've been through this before. I died. But they said I couldn't come out. Not yet." When asked who they were, he fell silent and then began to cry. Interestingly, in recent years there has been growing interest in the scientific community in the model of consciousness simulation, according to which what we perceive as life is a system built to achieve a certain result. At the same time, each person is a fragment of the observer, placed in an artificial context. Mistakes, suffering, coincidences are not bugs, but experimental conditions. Like in a game where every failure brings you closer to completing a level. Within this model, an exit point does exist, but it doesn't open at will. It opens based on state. When the observer, you, realizes they are inside the cycle, stops responding to stimuli, stops engaging in emotions, stops clinging to the self-image, the system loses control. And then a way out is possible. Tibetan monks called this transparency of the mind. Modern neurophysiologists call it neutral activation of the limbic zone. Esotericists call it enlightenment. But the essence is the same. The system ceases to hold on those who become aware of it. Sometimes it happens suddenly, like a flash, like a click. A person wakes up and realizes everything around is a dream. Not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. He feels that the world is a film, that he is not a body, and that he has already been here. A Japanese woman who experienced clinical death began to see images that resembled fragments of past lives after returning. She said she saw a fog-shrouded sky and a giant sphere from which rays of light were falling. When she looked at them, everything began to repeat itself, over and over again, until she turned away. Later, she said, the exit was not up, but inward. The final point in every cycle is always a choice, but it doesn't appear as a fork in the road. It comes as knowledge, silent, internal, wordless. It's the moment when you no longer fight, you no longer fear, you no longer expect a reward, you no longer hope. You simply understand that it's all over. And in that moment, you don't die. You remember. Some call it a moment of unpacking. Others call it absolute silence. Some describe hearing music, some describe being out of body, and some describe becoming everything at once. Reincarnation remains one of the most controversial topics, where the boundaries between science, philosophy, and personal experience are blurred. Cases collected from around the world do not yet provide a definitive picture, but they point to one thing: the memory of past lives is possible. Perhaps not always, not for everyone, and not in its full form, but it does manifest, sometimes spontaneously, sometimes under pressure of circumstances, sometimes in moments that cannot be measured by instruments. We've considered the hypotheses. We've compared the evidence. We've seen how this topic connects ancient texts, modern experiments, and personal stories. But there are still no answers. There are only facts. And there are questions. Why do some people remember and others don't? Why does memory sometimes return after trauma? And what if this mechanism is part of something larger that we don't yet understand? It's too early to draw any definitive conclusions. But one thing is clear: interest in these phenomena is growing. And if even part of what we've heard turns out to be true, it will change a lot. For now, everyone decides for themselves where coincidence ends and where system begins.